Have you ever watched someone dig their own grave while they were absolutely convinced they were laying the foundation for a skyscraper? That is exactly what I watched my nephew Brian do over the course of 10 long, agonizing days. I am sitting here in the boardroom, the air conditioning humming, with that familiar clinical drone that only industrial facilities have. Through the glass, I can see the factory floor below, a sprawling ecosystem of steel, automated arms, and precision machinery that I spent 30 years perfecting. Brian is pacing back and forth in front of me, his designer shoes clicking sharply against the polished concrete. He is sweating, even though the room is freezing. He is looking at his tablet, his thumb swiping frantically, his breathing shallow and erratic. He is surrounded by 3 of his consultants, young, well-dressed men who look like they have never stepped foot on a factory floor in their lives. They are whispering, pointing at screens, their faces drained of color. I am just sitting here. My hands are folded on the mahogany table. I have a cup of black coffee in front of me, and it is still steaming. I am not saying a word. I am not even looking at him. I am looking at the way the light catches the dust motes dancing in the air above the assembly line. Every time he stops and screams at his team to fix the override, I just take a slow, calm sip of my coffee. The irony is heavy, almost heavy enough to crush him. He thinks I am the one who locked him out of his own system. He thinks I am the one who crippled the entire production line. He is wrong. I didn't do anything to stop him. I simply stood back and let him prove that he had no idea how to run the engine he was trying to steer. I wasn't always just an owner, and this wasn't always just a factory. Before I became the man who sat in this chair, I spent 2 decades as a senior industrial systems consultant for the Department of Defense. I didn't learn my trade in a classroom or through some flash-in-the-pan tech incubator in Silicon Valley. I learned it in the bunkers. I learned it in the silent, high-security facilities where failure meant a national catastrophe. My philosophy has always been simple: legacy logic. In the world of high-stakes engineering, if it isn't broken, you don't touch it. If it works, you respect it. We built systems designed to survive EMPs, cyber warfare, and the slow decay of time. We didn't rely on the cloud. We relied on hardened, redundant, physical infrastructure. When I retired from that life, I took that discipline with me. I bought this factory not because I wanted to make a quick buck, but because I wanted to build something that would outlive me. I built this place like a vault. Everything was documented, every wire was accounted for, and every security protocol was written in a language that hadn't changed in 40 years because it didn't need to. It was rigid, yes. It was slow to update, maybe, but it was impenetrable. Then came Brian. He arrived fresh out of a business school program that specialized in disruptive innovation. He was family, my sister's son, and when he came to me asking for a job, I saw a chance to pass the torch. I saw a young man with ambition, a young man who wanted to make his mark. I brought him in as the VP of operations, thinking he would learn the ropes, appreciate the craftsmanship, and eventually take over. I was wrong. I didn't see the arrogance that came packaged with his education. He didn't look at my factory and see a marvel of engineering. He looked at it and saw a dinosaur. He didn't see stability. He saw stagnation. He started bringing in his own people, outsiders who spoke in buzzwords, optimization, synergy, agile workflows, and he started questioning everything I had spent my life building. He looked at my hardwired, air-gapped security protocols and called them an embarrassment to modern industry. He looked at my analog fail-safes and called them vestiges of the Industrial Revolution. He wasn't just trying to improve things, he was trying to erase me. He wanted to strip away the legacy logic and replace it with a sleek, networked, vulnerable mess that he claimed was the future. The disrespect didn't happen all at once. It was a slow drip. It started with him bypassing my direct reports, then ignoring my safety protocols, and finally, outright mocking the way I managed the floor. He wanted to bring the entire factory online, to hook every single machine into a centralized, internet-facing server so he could monitor the metrics from his smartphone while sitting in a coffee shop in the city. I warned him. I gave him the lecture. I told him that in this business, connection equals vulnerability. I told him that if you make everything accessible, you make everything a target. He just laughed. He looked at me with that pitying expression, the one that says, "Poor old man, you just don't get it." He told me that the world had moved on, and that I was an old fool, clinging to a dusty past that didn't exist anymore. He told me that my era was over, and that it was time for the new guard to take the wheel. He genuinely believed that he was the smartest person in the room, and he couldn't wait to prove it. He didn't just want to modernize the factory. He wanted to destroy the version of me that was in charge of it. He wanted to strip me of my authority, and 10 days ago, he thought he had finally succeeded. He didn't know that the trap wasn't something I had set for him. The trap was the system itself, and he had been walking into it since the day he first opened his mouth to insult me. The transition didn't happen overnight, but it felt like a collapse once it started. Brian began by clearing out the dead wood, which was his charming way of referring to the master engineers who had been with me for 15 years. Men who knew exactly which bolt to tighten when a machine started to vibrate at a certain frequency were replaced by college graduates who spent more time adjusting their headsets than looking at the factory floor. It was a parade of hubris. Brian was obsessed with what he called streamlined integration. He wanted every aspect of the manufacturing process to be visible on a dashboard, accessible from anywhere in the world. He wanted the factory to be a software company that just happened to produce steel parts. I watched him dismantle the foundation piece by piece, and the most cynical part of me found it fascinating. It was like watching someone try to turn a battleship into a speedboat by throwing the engine overboard. He didn't understand that the complexity of my systems wasn't a flaw. It was a buffer against the chaotic reality of industrial production. The day he finally locked me out remains vivid, not because of the anger I felt, but because of how utterly predictable his actions were. He called me into his office, a space that used to be mine, now redecorated with minimalist furniture that looked like it belonged in a high-end dentist's office. He had a smug look on his face, a mixture of self-satisfaction and nervous energy. He slid a tablet across the desk toward me. It was an access denial notification. He had changed the root security codes, the administrative passwords, and the physical override protocols. He hadn't just changed the locks. He had effectively severed my nervous system from the body of the company. I remember looking up at him, my expression blank, waiting to see if he would have the decency to look uncomfortable. He didn't. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and delivered the line he had clearly been rehearsing in front of a mirror. "Uncle," he said, his voice dripping with that particular kind of condescension that only the young and inexperienced can manufacture. "You're an old fool. The world runs on cloud integration now. This factory is a relic, and you are just a ghost haunting it. Go home, enjoy your pension, and try to learn how to use a smartphone. Your history." He genuinely thought that was the end of it. He believed that by clicking a few buttons and locking a door, he had rendered me obsolete. I didn't argue. I didn't get angry. I didn't beg for my position back. I simply stood up, straightened my jacket, and looked around the office one last time. There was nothing for me to say, because he had just made the mistake that every arrogant amateur makes. He assumed that power was defined by who held the keys, rather than who understood the lock. I walked out of that office, and left him to his modernization. I knew exactly what would happen. I had spent years documenting the fragility of the very systems he was so eager to implement. He was blind to the realities of the machine because he refused to study the manual. He thought the factory was just code and software. He didn't realize it was a living, breathing machine that required a human touch, a physical presence, and a deep, intuitive understanding of the mechanics. In the days that followed, I watched from a distance, or rather, I watched through the cracks he left behind. He was so confident in his digital fortress that he stopped checking the physical maintenance logs. He ignored the ghost server, an old isolated mainframe in the basement that I had kept running, specifically for data archival. He assumed it was junk, a piece of equipment left behind because I was too sentimental to throw it away. Because he didn't understand the purpose of that server, he didn't bother to secure it. He also ignored the manual overrides on the hydraulic presses. He thought they were unnecessary because, in his digital model, the software would always shut the machines down before they overheated. He didn't account for the reality of friction, wear and tear, or the occasional power surge that no software could predict. He was running a marathon, while ignoring the fact that his shoelaces were untied. He made small mistakes, almost daily. I saw them in the output reports that I could still access through the back-end nodes he hadn't bothered to secure. He would override a temperature alarm because he thought it was a false positive caused by legacy sensor lag. He would ignore a maintenance warning because it interrupted his production schedule. He was treating the factory like a video game, resetting the variables whenever he didn't like the outcome. Every time he ignored one of those warnings, he was adding another line of code to the trap he was building for himself. I sat in my study at home, drinking my evening tea, and every time I saw a new error message in the logs, I just smiled. He wanted to be the boss, the disruptor, the tech genius. He wanted to prove that he didn't need the old fool. Well, I was more than happy to let him prove it. I wasn't just observing him. I was curating the evidence. I was letting him dig deeper, letting him build the case against his own competence. He was so convinced that he had won, that he never stopped to ask why I wasn't fighting back. Silence is a terrifying thing when you don't understand it. And for 10 days, I gave him the heaviest silence of his life. I spent those 10 days in my home office, a quiet space lined with books and old blueprints. While Brian was busy playing the role of the visionary leader, I was busy playing the role of the auditor. People often assume that to beat someone like Brian, you need to be a master hacker or a digital genius. They think you need to bypass firewalls and write complex code to bring a system to its knees. That is a mistake born of watching too many movies. True power doesn't come from breaking into a system. It comes from understanding that the system is already broken. I didn't need to hack my way back into the factory. I just needed to look at the data Brian was leaking. He was so obsessed with his new cloud integration that he had left a dozen backdoors open. Backdoors he didn't even know existed because he was too lazy to audit the legacy hardware he was trying to replace. My tool of choice was the ghost server in the basement. It was an older unit, but it was rock solid. Because Brian viewed it as junk, he never bothered to change its credentials or restrict its access. He didn't even know it was still pinging the main network. I used it as a window. Every morning I would sit with my coffee, pull up the logs, and watch him systematically dismantle the safety protocols that kept this place from blowing itself apart. It was a masterclass in professional negligence. I tracked his activity with the cold detachment of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. He would force the programmable logic controllers, or PLCs, to run at 110% capacity because he wanted to impress the investors with higher output numbers. He didn't understand that those machines were designed to run at 85% to prevent overheating. He was treating a precision instrument like a toy. I kept a meticulous file, I didn't just note the errors. I recorded the timestamps, the exact manual overrides he initiated, and the specific regulatory compliance laws he was violating. It was all there in black and white. He was cutting costs by switching to a third-party server that was prone to latency spikes. I watched as the factory's safety sensors sent warning after warning to his dashboard. Warnings about pressure buildup in the hydraulic lines and temperature fluctuations in the cooling system. He ignored every single one of them. He labeled them as system noise or calibration errors. It was fascinating in a sick way. He was so desperate to be right that he was literally choosing to ignore the reality of the machine. He had convinced himself that his digital model was more accurate than the physical sensors, and he was willing to let the machinery burn to prove it. The investigation wasn't about catching him in a lie. It was about documenting his descent. Every day, I saw the same pattern. Brian would arrive at the office, full of nervous energy, and try to force a change that the system wasn't ready for. The system would fight back, sending alerts, and he would silence the alerts. He was essentially choking the factory to death. I started to draft a formal report. I wasn't doing it for the board yet. I was doing it for myself. I wrote down the sequence of events with the precision of a military briefing. I noted the date he disabled the emergency shutoff valves, and I noted the date he replaced the certified safety contractors with his own cheap, unverified team. It was a roadmap of disaster. The most cynical part of the process was watching him try to hide the evidence. He would delete the system logs, not realizing that the ghost server I was using had its own separate, hardwired backup. He was playing a game of digital whack-a-mole, constantly trying to scrub his trail, while I sat in the background and hit save on every single misstep. He was acting like a teenager trying to hide a scratch on his father's car, while I was documenting the entire accident in excruciating detail. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel like I was setting him up. I was merely holding a mirror up to his incompetence. If you want to run a factory, you have to respect the physics of the job. You can't negotiate with a hydraulic press, and you can't optimize your way out of a mechanical failure. Brian thought he could skip the hard work of learning the trade and just jump straight to the rewards. But the machine doesn't care about your resume or your ambition. The machine only cares about variables, and Brian was failing to manage them. By the 9th day, the system was screaming. The latency was getting worse. The output was becoming inconsistent, and the cooling systems were struggling to keep up with the forced production speed. I knew the end was coming. The cloud wasn't designed to handle the load he was putting on it. It was a house of cards, and the next surge in production was going to knock it down. I sat in my study, looking at the data, and I realized that I didn't need to do a single thing. I just needed to show up on the 10th day. I had the documents. I had the proof of his negligence, his violation of safety protocols, and his outright dismissal of the warning signs. I had him, and the best part was that he was the one who had handed me the keys to his own destruction, all while calling me an old fool. He thought the game was about who had the password to the mainframe, but the real game was about who understood the foundation. And while he was busy painting the walls of a house built on sand, I was standing outside, waiting for the tide to come in. The silence of those 10 days was about to be broken by the sound of everything he built coming apart at the seams. The morning of the board meeting was crisp, the kind of day that feels like a clean slate. I arrived at the factory 30 minutes early, dressed in the same charcoal suit I have worn to every major meeting for the last 20 years. The lobby was different now. Brian had replaced the classic oil paintings of our company founders with abstract digital screens that flashed stock tickers and market updates. It looked like a casino, not a manufacturing plant. I walked past the receptionist, who didn't even look up from her phone, and headed straight for the boardroom. I didn't need a key card. I knew which back panels were loose and which sensors were disabled. I walked in just as Brian was setting up his final presentation for the board of directors. He was in his element, surrounded by sleek laptops and glowing charts, trying to convince the board that his digital transformation was the greatest thing to happen to the company since its inception. When he saw me, he didn't look angry. He looked amused. He stood up, adjusted his slim-fit jacket, and offered a condescending smile. "Uncle," he said, loud enough for the investors to hear, "I think you're in the wrong place. This is a private meeting for stakeholders. The history department is down the hall." I didn't answer him. I didn't even acknowledge his joke. I simply pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the one that had been mine for a decade, and sat down. I placed a single, thick manila folder in front of me. The room went quiet. The investors, men and women who had known me since I was running this place with a clipboard and a pencil, looked at me with a mixture of confusion and respect. Brian's smile faded, replaced by that twitch of annoyance I had grown so used to seeing. He started his presentation anyway, his voice booming about synergy and real-time analytics. But he was nervous. He kept glancing at the screens, which were flickering. The factory floor was beneath us, and you could feel the vibration of the machines through the floorboards. It was a rhythm I knew better than my own heartbeat, and right then, the rhythm was wrong. The heavy hydraulic presses were stuttering, hitting a beat that wasn't standard. It sounded like an engine trying to breathe with a blocked airway. Then, the alarms began. They weren't loud at first, just a series of sharp, rhythmic pings coming from the overhead speakers. Brian ignored them, keeping his eyes on his slides, but the pings got faster, more insistent. A red light started flashing on his laptop screen. He tapped a key, trying to dismiss the notification, but the screen turned black. Then, the sound of the entire factory changed. The deep, rumbling hum of the assembly line, the sound of money being made, just stopped. A dead, heavy silence filled the boardroom. It was the sound of a system that had finally hit a wall it couldn't climb. Brian stopped mid-sentence. He looked at his tablet, then at the wall monitor, which was now displaying a series of critical failure codes in bright, ugly white text. He started tapping furiously, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed red. "It's a glitch," he stammered, looking at the board. "Just a minor latency issue. I'll have it back up in a second." He was panicked, and it showed. He was typing, clicking, and shouting commands into his headset, but the system was unresponsive. It was locked in a hard-stop loop, triggered by the very sensors he had mocked and ignored for 10 days. I sat there, arms crossed, watching him unravel. It was poetic. He had built his entire strategy on the idea that software could fix everything, but he had ignored the hardwired, physical safety shutoffs that I had installed years ago. When the sensors detected that the cooling systems were failing, they triggered a mandatory, irreversible system shutdown. It was a fail-safe, a piece of legacy logic that he couldn't bypass because he didn't even know where the physical override key was. He was trapped by his own arrogance. I stood up slowly, the movement quiet and deliberate. Every eye in the room was on me now. I walked over to the table and pushed the manila folder toward the board members. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I let the silence do the talking for me. Inside that folder was the evidence. It was everything. The timestamps of his unauthorized access, the proof of his safety violations, the records of the warning alarms he had manually overridden, and the regulatory compliance documents that he had ignored. It was a catalog of his incompetence, written in the language of facts and figures. The head of the board, a woman who had seen many of these meetings, opened the folder. As she turned the pages, her expression shifted from confusion to shock, and finally, to anger. Brian walked over to see what was in the folder, and when he saw his own signature on the log of disabled safety protocols, the color drained from his face. He looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't look like a visionary leader. He looked like a child who had just been caught setting the house on fire. He opened his mouth to explain, to offer some excuse, but the look in the board member's eyes stopped him cold. He realized that the game wasn't just over. He had lost everything, and he had done it all by himself. The boardroom felt smaller than it had 10 minutes ago. The air was thick, heavy with the realization that the man who had promised them a technological revolution had actually been leading them toward an industrial catastrophe. Brian stood there, his mouth moving, trying to form sentences, trying to blame the software, trying to blame me, but the words died in his throat. He looked at the board members, hoping for a shred of sympathy, but he found none. They weren't looking at him with pity. They were looking at him with the cold calculation of business owners who had just calculated the cost of his ego. The head of the board didn't even yell. She simply looked at him and said, "Leave. We will handle the legal cleanup, but your access is terminated. Do not step foot on these grounds again." It was the most professional, devastating sentence I had ever heard. There was no drama, no shouting, no dramatic exit. Just the quiet, absolute finality of a contract being terminated. Brian looked at me one last time, his face a mask of disbelief. He wanted me to intercede, to say it was all a misunderstanding, to play the old fool one more time. I didn't look up. I just poured myself another cup of coffee. He turned and walked out, his shoulders slumped, the weight of his own hubris finally settling on him. He wasn't just losing a job, he was losing his reputation. In an industry where trust is the only real currency, he was now broke. The aftermath was efficient. It wasn't about revenge, it was about restoration. While the board began the process of filing the necessary disclosures and assessing the damage Brian had done, I stood up and walked out onto the factory floor. The machines were still silent, frozen in that emergency hard stop state. I walked over to the main control panel, the one Brian had tried so desperately to digitize. I opened the casing, and there it was, the manual override key, gathering a thin layer of dust. I turned it. The system sighed. The cooling fans kicked back in, and one by one, the red error lights on the machines blinked out, replaced by the steady, reassuring green of standard operation. It took me an hour to reset the protocols, to clear the bloated software junk he had installed, and to bring the factory back to its original, reliable rhythm. It was a physical, grounding task. As I worked, I could hear the hum returning, the steady, powerful heartbeat of the factory that I had built. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't optimized, and it wasn't on the cloud. It was just stable. It was just right. By the time the sun began to set, the production line was moving again. The workers, the ones who had been nervous and on edge for the last 10 days, seemed to relax as the old rhythms returned. They knew these machines. They knew how to listen to the vibrations and how to interpret the heat. They didn't need a tablet to tell them when something was wrong. They could feel it in their bones. I stood by the glass, watching the steel move through the presses, and I thought about the nature of time. We live in a world that is obsessed with the new. We are constantly told that if something isn't updated, if it isn't connected, if it isn't disruptive, it is failing. We are taught to fear being left behind, to fear the label of the old fool, but there is a dangerous arrogance in that thinking. There is a profound difference between being obsolete and being timeless. The principles of engineering, gravity, thermodynamics, structural integrity, don't change just because we invent a new way to track data. They are constant. They are the bedrock of reality. Brian thought he could bypass those constants with speed and software. He thought he could outrun the laws of physics. He was wrong. He was so busy chasing the future that he forgot the importance of the present. He forgot that to innovate effectively, you first have to understand what you are building upon. You can't skip the lessons that experience teaches. You can't replace a lifetime of hard-won knowledge with a line of code. He was a student of the trend, not the trade. And in the end, it was that lack of depth that undid him. It wasn't my trap that caught him. It was the reality of the work itself. I didn't need to be cruel to him. I didn't need to scream or fight or pull him down. I just had to wait. I just had to be the foundation, the thing that stays, the thing that holds its ground while the waves of ego crash against it and break into nothing. As I walked out of the factory that night, the parking lot was quiet. My car was the only one left near the entrance. I unlocked the door, sat in the driver's seat, and took a deep breath. I felt a strange sense of peace. The storm had passed, the hierarchy was restored, and the factory was safe. People often ask me if I hate him, if I'm angry about the betrayal. I tell them no. How can you be angry at someone who never understood the stakes? He played a game he didn't know the rules to, and he lost. That isn't tragedy. That is just cause and effect. It is a lesson that everyone learns eventually, either through wisdom or through failure. I learned it years ago in the bunkers, in the cold, quiet spaces where mistakes were not an option. I survived because I respected the machinery, both the literal and the metaphorical. As I drove home, I realized that the title he gave me, the old fool, was the greatest compliment I had ever received, because the old fool is the one who is still standing when the system crashes. The old fool is the one who knows that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is keep things running exactly the way they were built to run. The world will keep chasing the next big thing, and they will keep breaking themselves against the truth of the world. And I will be here, steady, silent, and entirely, perfectly, at peace.